This webinar will begin in approximately 3 minutes. Again, this is a sound check. This webinar will begin in approximately 3 minutes. Thank you. This is your 1-minute warning. This webinar will begin in 1 minute. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rotor Consulting's webinar on When Weather Changes Project Management. My name is Christina Reed. I am the Assistant to the President here at Rotor Consulting and your host for today's webinar. In a few moments, I will introduce you to Trey Rotor, speaker for today's webinar. But before I do that, I need to let you know about some housekeeping items. For those of you returning to our webinars, welcome back. And for those of you who are brand new to Rotor Consulting's webinars, welcome. You are in for a very special treat. Now, to the right of your screen, you will see a question and answer panel. This is how we will be able to communicate with one another throughout the next hour. Please feel free to utilize this question and answer panel to ask us any questions or comments. Please also include your city, country, and your question and or comment. We do have allotted times during the course of this webinar where we will answer your questions. So please feel free to answer them throughout the entire, or ask them throughout the entire webinar. As always, I will be tweeting about this webinar. Rotor Consulting has a presence on Twitter. Our name is @RotorConsult, and for today specifically, the webinar's hashtag will be WeatherPM, standing for Weather in Project Management. So please feel free to join me. I will be tweeting, and if you're not by your Twitter account, feel free to follow us at the end of this webinar. Should you have any questions, problems, concerns, the platform goes blank, please feel free to call WebEx. The phone number is on the screen, but it is 866-229-3239, and the event number is 798-683-074. Again, if you have any problems, please feel free to contact WebEx. As always, the PowerPoint presentation handout will be available at the end of this webinar, as well as your downloadable free PDU form. Now, as always, this is a global webinar, and we are excited that Rotor Consulting will be touching 6 continents, 38 countries, and 712 people around the world. That is absolutely phenomenal, and I welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This month, Rotor Consulting has a special LinkedIn promotion. If you join our LinkedIn group, you will receive a coupon code for 15% off your next purchase with Rotor Consulting. And if you're already a member, don't worry. All you need to do is post a discussion and or a comment, and you'll receive the code as well. Now, this code is only going to be available for 15% until midnight tonight. The code doesn't expire until November 30th, but tomorrow, when we release it to the general public, it'll go down from 15% to 10%. So if you want to utilize the 15% today, I would suggest, like I said, joining our LinkedIn group, posting a comment, or posting a discussion. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Trey Rotor. Mr. Rotor, who is a PMP, is the president and founder of Rotor Consulting. Years ago, he successfully managed the largest plant retooling project in the history of a major printing company, enabling the company to enter a new market and source $100 million in revenue. In 2001, after serving as a consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton, Mr. Rotor founded Rotor Consulting, a respected and premier project management consulting and training firm. Mr. Rotor is recognized as a global expert on project management. He regularly speaks at global project management events, including the Project Management Institute's global congresses, where he once received the coveted Encore presentation. He has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, MSN Money, Microsoft Press, the Project Management Institute, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, just to name a few. And in 2011, on the 10th anniversary of founding Rotor Consulting, Mr. Rotor released his best-selling book, A Sixth Sense for Project Management. In his book, Mr. Rotor details how to achieve project success by deploying a balanced approach with a particular emphasis on people. Mr. Rotor and his family currently reside in Cleveland, Ohio. He is a member of the Northeast Ohio chapter of the Project Management Institute. He holds a BA in economics from the University of Illinois and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. As always, please help me welcome Mr. Trey Rotor.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Christina. And thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the Rotor Consulting webinar. We hope you'll join us every month. If you've been with us before, welcome back. It's great to see you. I'd also like to start by sending out a personal thanks to you, Christina, for all of the work that you did. This webinar has Christina's fingerprints all over it. It was her idea. She did the research. She interviewed many people, and you're going to hear the results of that in a little bit. And she's worked very hard on this. So thank you so much, Christina, for all that you have done.
You're welcome.
So today we are going to talk about the weather. We decided to talk about the weather, and Christina came up with this idea initially because there's a lot going on right now related to the weather. We'll share more on that in a little bit. But how do we manage our projects when we have to pay attention to the weather? What can we do to be proactive? What can we do to anticipate what might be happening? And how can we mitigate any potential concerns that may come from the weather? You see here a picture of Hurricane Katrina. This picture was initially shown to me a number of years ago by Christine Zust, one of our speakers, and Christine Zust likes to use this in her communications course that she teaches through Rotor Consulting. You see, what she likes to do is initially she will show this picture with the top 75% of the screen blacked out. So take another look at this picture on your screen and imagine yourself looking at this only seeing the road, the sun, and not the circular hurricane cloud above. Her point is that sometimes we don't communicate everything that's going on. We only communicate part of it. But the rest of the story is, and then in her next slide, she shows the full picture. It's an amazing shot of a hurricane coming into New Orleans. Let's start by taking a poll. We'd like to ask you, have your projects been impacted by the weather? On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see that this poll is now open. You have the opportunity to select the radio button for yes or the radio button for no. The poll will be open for 60 seconds. In fact, at this point, it will be open for another 40 seconds. It's already been open for 20. When the poll closes, it takes the WebEx system about 30 seconds to summarize the results. With the number of people that we have here, it may take a little bit longer. As soon as we have the answer, we will share it back to you. I can tell you from the responses that each of you filled out to join this webinar that there are many of you who have had projects that have been impacted by the weather. And I suspect as we get into this conversation, even more of you will realize through something that I'm going to refer to as hidden yardage, more on that later on, that each of us have had projects that have been impacted by the weather. Our 60 seconds is now up. The poll is closed. Thanks to all of you who responded to it. And in a moment here, we will have the response from the WebEx system. About 10 more seconds here, and we'll be able to tell you of the people who are with us right now, what percentage of you have had a project that you believe has been impacted by the weather. And here are the results. 172 folks saying yes, 101 saying no, and more than 100 with no answer. So of those who responded, well more than 50% of you can say that the weather has impacted your projects. We're going to do another poll now. Poll 2 will be opening up on the right-hand side of your screen. It is now open. Select all that apply. You don't have to pick only one answer here. As we look through the feedback that we heard, and as we took a serious look at the conversations that Christina had with each of you over the last month, we found that most of the impact of weather fell into one of these 5 categories. Some sort of delay in the timeline or an acceleration of the timeline. We heard of folks who were rushing to get certain things done before a pending storm. An adjustment of project prioritization. This was very common, where before a storm or after a storm, people needed to adjust. One of the stories that you're going to hear is a gentleman who was setting up some software in New Orleans, and after the problem, the weather-related problem that they had there that we all know about, that we'll hear about today, his priorities changed and many of his resources were assigned to a different project. We also heard about many travel plans that were impacted and many meetings, training sessions, reports, and so on that were all impacted by the weather. This poll is now closed, and in a moment here we will be able to see what % of you have experienced each of these different sorts of delays in your projects. And here you have it. And if you're unable to see it, I will read for you what the survey is telling us. 20% of you have had a delay in your timeline. 2% have had an acceleration of the timeline. 7% have experienced an adjustment or reallocation of project priorities. Some 14% of you have seen an impact on travel plans, and 11% of the total group have had impacted meetings. About half of the group did not reply, so double all those numbers to get a more accurate measurement. In other words, it's really probably about 40% of the group has a delay in timeline, 30% have had impacted travel plans, and so on. These are large numbers that we are dealing with here. So thank you for your responses in the survey. Let's take a look at what has happened. What has happened in the last several years? Why are we talking about weather? Is there an acceleration of extreme weather? Well, here's some interesting facts for you. As of the middle of this year, 46% of the United States had had unusually wet or unusually dry conditions. A number of states had the wettest March through May, the wettest spring on record. There were 1,300 daily precipitation records set in April, and the Mississippi River had some serious flooding earlier this year. A lot of excess precipitation. In fact, here in Cleveland, Ohio, we are on the verge of setting the dubious record of having the most precipitation ever in history, and the snow hasn't even started yet. We also found that there was a lot of dry weather. In fact, the spring in Texas was the driest on record. I heard something interesting in the news this morning. As I was exercising, I was watching television, and on the television there was a picture of a FedEx DC-10, this is a huge airplane, leaning back like this, as if it were about to take off. And in front of this DC-10 that was motionless, you saw a car driving by. And I thought to myself, that's interesting. They must have used some sort of trick photography where they showed this airplane taking off, and then they froze that image, and they had cars driving past. Here's what happened. It turns out that a dry storm, a dry thunderstorm, has impacted Texas, and that caused this plane to be upended, and it was just sitting there looking like that. Imagine the force to make this happen. So because of the dryness now, we have a lot of unusual things happening. By the way, a dry thunderstorm is the same as a regular thunderstorm, except when the precipitation goes up into the clouds, as the storm matures, instead of rain coming down, by the time it gets to the ground, there is no rain because there isn't enough precipitation. But you still get the winds and all of the other activities that go along with the thunderstorm. Fascinating. Well, it's more than a lot of rain. It's more than not enough rain. We had the most active April on record in the United States with 875 tornadoes. We also had the most wildfire activity on record in the United States in April with almost 2 million acres burned. Well, are you curious about what the future looks like? Here's what it looks like for the United States. You can see your region here if you're joining us from the U.S. You'll see that none of us can expect normal. For some, it'll be warmer than normal. For others, it will be cooler than normal. What else is going on? Well, the snow collapsed the roof in the Metrodome. There were snowstorms, serious snowstorms in the Northeast. Boston had a lot of snow, more than they were used to, and in the South. San Francisco received its first snowfall in 35 years. Congratulations, San Francisco. Queensland, Australia had serious flooding. Brazil had mudslides. Hurricane Irene came up the eastern seaboard and impacted part of Canada as it dissipated. New Zealand had an earthquake. We all well know about the disastrous earthquake that hit Japan and the subsequent tsunami in March of this year. Chile experienced an earthquake, and of all places, Virginia, a place where we didn't think there was going to be an earthquake, but Virginia experienced a serious earthquake that led to a variety of things, including the Washington Monument now needing to be repaired due to the damage. We talked about wildfires, specifically now in Texas. 100,000 acres were burned in March. How about the volcano in Iceland? The year after the massive eruption, do you remember this, with the ash that stopped flights going back and forth from Europe and many other areas? A year later, there was an additional eruption. We're going to hear at the end of the seminar today a story about how that ash impacted one gentleman's project. And record-breaking heat in various areas. A lot of extreme weather around the world just in the last 6 to 9 months. Now, let's ask another question here. We're going to open up a poll again. Do you include weather as a risk in your planning process? In other words, when you're going through planning out your project, planning out the timeline, the budget, and looking at contingencies, is risk one of the things that you look at? A simple yes or a no. Now, something interesting happened as we were talking to people. As we had conversations with folks, specifically as Christina, sitting across the table from me here, had conversations with folks, we found almost uniformly that people said to us, I include risk now, I include weather now as one of the risks that I take care of. It only takes one experience for this to happen. Yet, nonetheless, many of us still may not include weather as one of the risks in our projects. This poll is 5 seconds now from closing, and when it closes, we will be able to play back to you the amount of people, the percentage of this community that thinks weather is one of the risks. Now, another thing that's interesting here is when we talk about weather, where a lot of people's heads typically went to is, well, I need to plant seeds, and of course the weather is impacted by that. I need to work outside. My projects are construction projects, and of course the weather is going to have an impact on that. However, we also heard many stories of people whose projects weren't outside, weren't what you thought would be directly impacted by weather, yet they were. And here we have our results. It turns out that the vast majority of the group with us today does not include weather as one of the risks in their projects. Perhaps 50% or more, 75% or so of this audience is not including weather as one of the risks, and a small minority is. Excellent. As you know, anytime I'm talking about project management, I like to start with the PMBOK guide. So I looked through version 4.0, which is the latest version of the PMBOK, and I wanted to see what it had to say about weather. The entire contents of PMBOK 4.0's guidance on weather is on your screen. There's one chart in the PMBOK that shows a risk breakdown structure. So picture a work breakdown structure where you're taking the different elements of your project and decomposing it into the pieces of work. In this risk breakdown structure, the PMBOK starts, the top box says project. And then beneath that, there are a series of categories of the different sorts of risks, internal, external. One of the boxes has the word weather. And there you go. We also looked at one of the books that is broadly considered by many to be the textbook on project management. Project Management, a Systems Approach is now in its 10th edition. And we looked through there to see what it might tell us in terms of proactively managing the weather in our projects and mitigating the risks of weather. And what we learned is summarized here on the screen. So, we were left to you as a community of project managers and practitioners to tell us, how do you deal with weather? How has weather impacted your projects? What did you learn from it? And what can we all learn from it to do better with ours? I am now in a moment going to hand off back to Christina. She will share with you 5 different stories that we heard from you as a community of project managers on how you have managed weather and what your lessons learned are. Please welcome back Christina.
Hello again. A few weeks ago, I sent out an email to some of the registrants on this webinar, and I asked them the simple question: has weather affected your projects? Plain and simple. And I received a slew of emails and phone calls saying, yes, weather has affected my project. So here are a couple of stories I'd like to share. The first person I spoke to was Neil. Neil works for an agricultural company that is based in the United States and in Canada. And his project, plain and simple, he produces shell and snap peas. Now he has 3 weeks in these various locations where he needs to plant the seeds, and so that's planting, and then tracking and harvesting. The whole project usually takes 5 to 6 months. And weather, of course, being outside impacts his project. If there's rain during planting season, then that means he has to shift and change certain things that'll happen during the tracking and harvesting season. And if there's rain during harvesting, it shuts down harvesting for a day, which means that he not only has to shift his schedule, but he also has to get more manpower to harvest. So thank you, Neil, very much for sharing your story. Lessons learned: in the agricultural field, especially when you're working outside, you must adapt to the weather. And when weather comes, your priorities have to change. The next person I talked to was Jeff. Jeff works for a hydroelectric company in the western part of the United States. His project is to realign a canal with epoxy. Now, this project, of course, is done outside. It's an above-ground canal, and it has to be done in the spring due to government regulations. And wouldn't you believe, in spring of last year, there was a snowfall, late spring snowfall. He didn't say how many inches, but it was enough to affect his project. One of the key aspects was that they needed to clear a 10-mile road to get trucks and materials to the site. It cost them $75,000 from their budget. This, of course, changed not only their cost, but the 2 to 3 days that it took to clear this road changed their schedule. And as you can see, they were required to pay the contractors who were unable to work. While they were able to get a majority of the project done, they couldn't get the completed project done. So what are some of the lessons learned here? Well, now you need to, or now Jeff factors in weather costs, the scheduling delay, and you also need to realize what you're negotiating in your contract as far as your contractors are concerned to account for the weather. So thank you very much, Jeff, for sharing your story as well.
I like the actual falling snow part.
I thought it was a, you know, a nice.
It'll look like that here very soon.
I know. Don't. We're not going to talk about that. Tony works for an IT company that supports a utility company in Canada, and pretty much his project is simple. When there's bad weather, he needs to make sure that his company supports the utility company. For in any situation, when weather is at its worst, the company has to be at their best. Not only do they have to stock up on additional materials and resources, but they have to make sure that their people are ready as well. And two things, he told me, that are affected by the weather are the project delivery and the scope. This utility company needs to make sure that their systems work in any condition, so they have multiple backup applications that can run in bad weather. They also have to figure out who needs help first. They create a triage system to figure out who gets power, and then from there, they move on. Lessons learned here, stay calm. You cannot predict the weather. You can only anticipate it. So just stay calm. And also to make sure that you do build enough contingency into your project to make sure that you have the available resources and people so that you're not struggling in the end. So thank you, Tony, very much for your story as well. Steve works for a telecommunication company, and I was most intrigued by this story because it surrounded Hurricane Katrina, and we all knew the sheer devastation of Katrina. Steve's project was to roll over voice over IP to about 30,000 circuits. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, a lot of his equipment and switches ended up underwater. The provisioning group that was basically overseeing his project decided to immediately suspend this project, said, we can't do it, it's not helping New Orleans in the restoration process, so we are putting your project on hold, and we're taking your resources and reallocating them to restoring, rerouting, rebuilding, basically making sure that New Orleans gets back on the map. As I mentioned, we didn't know the impact of Katrina, let alone any hurricane that hits land, but we do need to be prepared, and we need to understand that weather can impact our project prioritization and resource availability overnight in a matter of hours, minutes, seconds, you name it, it can change in an instant, so we need to be prepared. When I sent out this mass email, I did receive some people who didn't have a specific project in mind, but said weather is a very important part of my project planning. And Curtis, who works for a company in Illinois, said that exactly to me. Since he lives in Illinois, I believe in southern Illinois, he said that tornado season is on his mind when he's planning projects. He likes to keep the production as well as all relative and important information backed up and off-site as a mitigation plan. And as you'll hear, a lot of other people said you need to back up your resources and you need to make sure that you communicate all that's going on in your projects to other people. So thank you, everyone, for responding. These were the 5 stories I had, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Trey and see what questions come up, because I see a number of them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina, for sharing those wonderful stories, and thanks to each of you who contributed in those stories. Now, I can anticipate some of you right now, if I could look into your heads, you're probably saying, those are interesting stories, but I'm not planting seeds, I'm not working on pipeline outside, I'm not at a utility where there's people out working in the weather. Why do I need to be concerned about weather in my project? We're going to talk about that now. I remember a number of years ago when I was working for one of Rotor Consulting's clients in Kansas. It was in the evening, perhaps 7:30 or so, 8 o'clock at night. Sun had recently set, and I was on a high floor of a Sheraton hotel. And there were very high winds coming in, exceptionally high winds. And at the top of the Sheraton hotel, there was a red S that was perhaps 2 stories tall. And this red S from the wind came flying off the building, went down into the street below where there was moving traffic, and shattered into a million pieces. The next day, one of my colleagues was traveling home. He was at the airport in Kansas City, Missouri, and the airport had a tornado warning. And everyone from the airport was shuttled down into the basement where they remained for the next 3 hours. Travel delays and other things like this are what we call the hidden yardage. Now, I'm borrowing that term from a football game I watched over the weekend. I was watching an American football game, and the announcer was talking about hidden yardage. These are things that don't show up in the statistics of the football game, but that make an important difference in field position. For example, a receiver catches the ball on the 20-yard line. The defender is wrapped up his ankles, but the receiver falls backwards in such a way where he gains an extra yard or 2. No statistic shows that he fell in the right way to gain that, but it's hidden yardage that helped him. There's also hidden yardage in the football game of a variety of mistakes that could be made that hurt the team. Weather is hidden yardage in our projects. Weather, of course, can impact electrical power. I recently had a conference call scheduled with a gentleman from India. I dialed into the conference call, and no one was there. I tried emailing the gentleman. I couldn't get through. I tried to phone the gentleman, and I couldn't get through. And after 15 or 20 minutes, I figured we weren't going to be having that call. I found out much later in the day, when his power had been restored, that a major storm had come through India. This, for many parts of India, is a stormy season that we're in now, and the power had gone down. Of course, this can happen in any of our projects. Travel to meetings, travel to kickoffs, travel to the client, anything travel related, whether you're driving or flying or taking a boat or a train, all of these things, of course, are subject to travel. And if you're traveling virtually, well, that's subject to the weather as well. Resource availability. Have you ever considered, if you're in an area where people need to shovel snow in the winter, that it may turn out that they end up in the office an hour or 2 later than they normally would? Now, let's say you put together a project plan where you have the amount of time people are going to spend on the project mapped out. That couple hours where they have to leave early, or the end of the day where they need to leave early to beat the storm, that's time out of your project schedule. And you might say, you know, Trey, I don't know when the storm is going to hit. Yes, that's accurate. However, it's a fair bet that sometime over the winter, if you're living in certain parts of the world, there are going to be storms. So is that a contingency in the project? I was in Charlotte, North Carolina a number of years ago, and there was forecast to be snow. And because there was forecast to be snow, all of the schools shut down, all of the businesses let out early, all of the restaurants shut down, because Charlotte simply wasn't equipped with the amount of equipment that, say, Chicago, Illinois might have to deal with that snowstorm. So it's not just the actual event, sometimes it's also the anticipation of that event that can impact our resources. And from a connectivity standpoint, we all have internet access, cell phones, BlackBerry users. I'm sorry, I know it's been a tough 2 weeks with the outages that have happened there. I'm not sure that that particular one was weather related. In fact, it probably wasn't because it was worldwide. But the weather can impact all of these sorts of things, and that's the hidden yardage of our projects. How about the attitudes of people? If there's a major storm coming in, if you're sitting, as I was, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and there's a storm coming in that's forecast to be an unprecedented storm, and you know what happens in the news these days, it becomes a big deal. Even if it is not going to be a big storm, these things get trumped up. People on your team are likely to be thinking about it, worried about it. Is Johnny going to make it home safe from school? This is all hidden yardage of weather on our projects. And how about the health of our team members? Hidden yardage. If a team member's sick, they're not contributing to the plan. Can you forecast that people are going to be sick? Can you forecast that Lisa will be sick on April 15th? If you can, let me know. That would be impressive. But odds are we can't forecast it, but we can bet that a certain percentage of our team might be impacted with colds in the winter. In the summer, a lot of folks get air conditioning colds. Sometimes they're even worse than winter colds. Allergy season can impact the productivity of our projects. We talked about people out shoveling snow. What does that do to your back, to your knees? All kinds of things that can happen. In one of my projects, there was a gentleman who lived in Florida who was down for an entire week because he had to go back home to board up his house. All of these things happen, and they're hidden yardage of our projects. Let's share with you another story. Jackie from a company based in Indiana was managing a project for the state, and they had scheduled a team kickoff meeting in Baton Rouge the day after Hurricane Katrina hit. Now, Baton Rouge was less directly impacted by the hurricane, but all of the flights were being rerouted. The project of scheduling flights had undergone a major reprioritization because of the weather. And as a result, Jackie was unable to have her kickoff meeting. So the contingency that they developed is to meet virtually and also to decompose that large group meeting into smaller groups that could continue to work and get things done until they were able to, at a later date, have the kickoff meeting. Here's just a sampling of what we heard from you. As we look through the feedback that you shared with us as you signed up for this webinar, you talked about hurricanes preventing your team from traveling for a project review, all kinds of flights that were canceled, delayed, rescheduled due to weather, snow impacting your weather, snow impacting your project, blowing sand impacting the project and the availability of resources, and so on. All of this, the hidden yardage. All right, well, what can we do? What can we do to get on top of this? Well, first, we can look at weather as one of the risks in our projects, adding it to our plan. Maybe not with a specific date associated with it, but as you go into a season, if you're in Fargo, you know it's going to be cold. And you know there's going to be some days where people might have more difficulties starting cars or getting into the office. You might not know exactly when, but it's a fair bet that it's going to happen. So perhaps you add that in as a contingency. How about a backup plan for connectivity? What if you can't launch that meeting? What if you can't make the phone call that you're trying to? If it's important, what is plan B? If you're distributing goods, products, What's your plan B or your plan C to get them from A to B? And how about safety? Many of these storms, many of these natural disasters, of course, can have a safety impact. We're not always completely accurate at knowing when they're going to come. So if it springs on you all of a sudden, what can you do to make sure that you and your team are safe? We can also be more proactive in terms of how we think about our projects and the weather. One of the long-standing rules that Rotor Consulting has is that if we are going to have a training session or if one of our speakers is going to be speaking at an event, if at all possible, we never book the last available flight that will get us there on time. We always want to leave at least one flight option and ideally 2 or 3 flight options, where if the flight that we're scheduled to be on doesn't go, we can still get there on another flight. I also like to, if possible, leave the driving contingency in there. If I'm flying to Chicago, I think about if my flight doesn't take off on time and gets delayed, can I still drive there if I need to and get there on time? There's also things we can do to help our team be healthy. We can replace the donuts with healthy snacks. We can replace some of the sodas, perhaps with tea or other more healthy alternatives. So as you think through your particular project, your particular situation, I know you're looking at this thinking, goodness, really, one more thing I need to worry about as a project manager, the health of my teammates? Well, it can make a difference. And when the cold weather hits, or the hot weather, where there's air conditioning, a healthy team is a more productive team. We also want to be sure to acknowledge the weather when it's on people's minds. If people are thinking about the weather, let's acknowledge that. It really all comes down to awareness. When Christina and I sat down a couple months ago and started working on this webinar, we really didn't know where the data was going to take us. We didn't know what the stories were going to say. We weren't sure, frankly, what we were going to say in terms of what to do to mitigate the weather. Because after all, there's only so much we are able to do to look into the future. There's only so much we can do to mitigate certain things. There's a lot beyond our control. But when we look through all of the information, when we listened to the stories, it all came back to the first discipline of a sixth sense of project management, and that is awareness. Awareness of how weather might impact our projects, an understanding of what we can do to proactively get on top of that, and then some sort of a mechanism to monitor and track what's happening. Now in a moment here, we're going to take your comments and questions, and Christina has been busily looking at them and typing across the table from me, so I know we have some good things coming in. I'd like to share with you one of the many success stories that we heard of a gentleman who sifted through the ashes to find project success. Greg was working on a project in Finland. By the way, as you may know, Rotor Consulting is partnered with more PMI chapters than any other company across the globe, and we are very pleased to welcome PMI Finland as one of our recent chapters. So for those of you from Finland, a personal hello. Thank you for joining us. We're pleased to have you on the webinars. Well, coincidentally, Greg happened to be in Finland working on a different project. He had a kickoff meeting that he couldn't get to because of the volcanic ash. Well, he was faced with a choice. Should he cancel the kickoff meeting or go to plan B? And Greg decided to go to plan B. You see, what he did is he took the second in charge, quickly shared with that person the information that they needed to be successful, and had that person successfully launch the kickoff meeting. As you can imagine, this isn't something that could be done if your second in charge doesn't already have a high level of comfort and familiarity with the project. So one of Greg's lessons learned that he shared with us is make sure you have someone who can be a reliable backup for you if the weather or anything else causes you not to be where you want to be. Train that person, have them up to speed so they can quickly step in if they need to.
Another thing that he said was that if he hadn't communicated with his team, the project would have been a failure, or the launch would not have happened. And that from now on, anytime he travels, he is going to have a backup plan because he does not want to be stuck across the pond again in this particular situation. So Greg is one of the people that said, you know what, weather impacted my project, and from here on out, it is going to be a factor.
Thank you so much, Christina, for filling in more details, and thank you, Greg. I think that story is representative of how many of us have started factoring weather into our projects. I have learned much of what I've learned about project management by a 2x4 across the head, and weather has been one of those 2x4s. So many of the things I do now in terms of not taking the last flight out and making sure I can drive there if I need to, and a variety of other things have come from experiences where things did not work the way I had hoped they were going to work. Again, in a moment, we'll take your questions and comments. I'd like to pause here to talk for a moment about our LinkedIn group. Christina shared with you a special promotion that we're offering on our LinkedIn group. This has become one of the largest groups for any project management training company, and I'd like to thank each of you for making it that sort of a group. Here's an example, a few examples of the sorts of things that are being discussed right now on our LinkedIn group. One of the gentlemen who's a member of the group posted an article from the Wall Street Journal. This is a recent article. It just came out in the middle of September, and this article is called "The Yogurt Made Me Do It." This has yielded great conversation on our LinkedIn group, and as I have been traveling around conducting our training sessions in the last month, I have been sharing the story of "The Yogurt Made Me Do It." This is a story about intuition and gut feeling, listening to our heart and our mind and our gut, which those of you who are regulars will recognize as how we define a whole body decision. And there's scientific research in this article that says that those who are unable to tune in to their whole body, according to this scientific researcher, are literally unable to make decisions. As you think about things like the weather, where it's very hard for us to know exactly what to do, a whole body decision, as described in this Wall Street Journal article, can be a good way to help us find the path. I was in Denver last Friday, and someone from our Denver class excitedly joined the LinkedIn group, and that night found an article from Harvard Business Review written by Daniel Goleman and shared that with the group. Now, Daniel Goleman, you might recognize as the author of Emotional Intelligence. Emotional Intelligence was published almost 20 years ago now, talking about how our emotions impact our ability to be successful. This article is from Harvard Business Review. It's called The Must-Have Leadership Skill, and it talks about how important interpersonal skills are, again, written by Daniel Goleman, who is very well known as the author of Emotional Intelligence. Now, we started a discussion 9 months or so ago on what's more important, people skills or technical project management skills. This has had 41 posts to it now. If you're interested in that, take a look at this post and see what your colleagues are saying about the importance of people skills. What you're going to find is that your colleagues are saying, by and large, they believe people skills are more important than those technical project management skills. And of course, survey after survey has shown that. And as always, we will take questions that we don't have time to get to in today's webinar, and we will share them with our group on LinkedIn. So if you join the group today, we are offering a one-day, to you, our webinar audience, 15% discount. If you were looking to get a copy of the book, to sign up for one of our online courses, or if we're coming to your town, this would be the time to do it. It's rare that we offer across-the-board discounts such as this, but we are encouraging people to be a part of the community on LinkedIn. We have so much fun with it, and we've gotten so much positive feedback on it that we wanted to share it with everyone. As Christina described, here's what happens. If you join the group, or if you're a current member and post a discussion, we will send you the coupon code that will be good for 6 or 7 weeks. So this coupon code will be good until late November. Perhaps you're not sure that you want to sign up yet, but you might at some point. If you sign up today by midnight Eastern, 15%. If you don't use it, hold on to that coupon. Anytime in the next 6 or 7 weeks until November 30th, you can get 10%. One of the common questions we get after these webinars is, are you recording them? I'd like to share it with one of my colleagues who was unable to make it. The answer is yes, we are recording the webinars and they are available. You can find them on our website. We charge a nominal amount to help cover our costs for doing the webinar. The 15% discount is applicable towards those as well. If you want to grab some extra PDUs, we have 7 of them now that are recorded in addition to this one. You can go back and take a look at those webinars and grab them. All right, let's see what sort of questions and comments we're getting. Christina, what are you hearing from the group today?
Well, it's kind of funny. We have one question and then a number of comments from Jim McGinnis.
Yep.
So I'll start with our question, and
yes.
Please feel free to continue asking questions. Molly writes, since weather is not predictable, how do you figure what percentage of the reserve should you dedicate to weather risk?
Yeah, great question, Molly. Since it's hard to predict the weather, how do we determine what percentage of the reserve? And I asked myself the same question. That's what I went to the PMBOK for, and I didn't find the answer there. That's what I went to a variety of project management books, and I didn't find the answer. Here's an idea for you. My head goes back to PERT. PERT you will recognize as an estimating system that was developed by the United States military some 50 or 60 years ago to create some sort of certainty around things that were very uncertain. And the standard PERT metric, which you can find in the PMBOK, takes the least likely scenario. So if you're forecasting weather, what's the least likely scenario in terms of how much time will be lost? What is the largest scenario? I'm sorry, let me say this differently. Instead of least likely, what PERT really wants you to do is say, what's the lowest amount of time that you might lose, or the lowest amount of budget that you might lose? So as you think about it, how weather might impact your project, what's the best case scenario? And then what's the worst case scenario? And what's the most likely scenario? And you take the most likely scenario in the traditional PERT model, you multiply it times 4, you add on 1 time the least likely and 1 times the most likely, and you divide it by 6. Now, some people might change those numbers and change the math of that formula, but as I think about this and how to directly quantify the weather, I think it's as good as anything that I have found. Great question. Thank you.
So Jim, who has just blown up our question and answer and comment
section. More the better.
section.
Keep going. Keep going.
He says, Trey pointed out that records are continuing to be set regarding intense storms.
Yeah.
Part of his project portfolio includes adaptation and mitigation of climate change in the forecast service. And he has been, you had mentioned forest fires.
Yes.
He said that between insect infestation due to warm weather in the winter and fire, he has spent 50% of their money on mitigating this. So that is huge.
No kidding. Very interesting. So it sounds like what Jim works in business of weather, and what he's finding is that there truly are some unusual things that are happening. You know, we looked, as Christina and I went through this, we were looking for statistics, and because we've heard it talked often, are things really different with the weather than they have been in the past? We found a lot of data behind that indicating that things might be very different, but nonetheless, whether they are or aren't, there's always going to be weather, of course, and there's always going to be an impact that weather has on our projects. As you may be quite familiar with, the profession of project management overall does not have a very good success rate. And we haven't found hard data on weather correlating to this, but I suspect that weather and other things that we can put in that category of hidden yardage are just the sorts of things that could lead for our projects to fail. So to the extent we can be more aware of all of these different sorts of things and proactive in thinking about them, now I believe it's one of the things that we need to do as a profession to improve our success rate. Do we have other comments or?
And I just wanted to add, Jim is from the U.S. Forest Service, and he says that it is anticipated that the intensity of storms will continue to increase and that the climate will continue to warm. The impacts will continue to increase.
Thank you, Jim.
Biju, I believe that's his name, asks, with weather getting more severe each year, do you think we always have a plan B ready for each activity that could be affected by bad weather?
Yeah, I think so. I think ideally, the ideal answer is there's always a plan B. Now, the realistic answer is that I know in many of your projects, there's so much going on, there's so many meetings, that you can't reasonably develop a contingency for everything. So how I would think about this is in terms of what are those most important meetings, what are those items on the critical path, and what would happen if the critical path or those critical items were impacted by weather, and what can you do about those? So that's a technique that you can use to keep it manageable, because there's a lot of different things we need to keep our eye on. But for those critical path items, weather could make a very big difference in what's happening in your projects. It comes back to awareness. So each of you decide for your project, for your situation, how do you want to anticipate it? Probably time for one more, Christina.
This is an interesting question. Madhu writes, do you need to look into weather history for considering the impact on the future?
Yeah, thank you, Madhu. Do you need to look into weather history to look at the impact in the future?
No.
The history of what has happened with weather certainly is a guide for us. However, I'm reminded of the disclaimers that are put on a mutual fund, for example, that say past performance is not a proper indicator of future performance. It may or may not indicate it. So what the weather has done historically can give us some lessons, without a doubt. History is always a teacher. But the caveat is, history rarely tends to repeat itself in exactly the same way, in exactly the same context. So if you become expert on one natural disaster and when it came in and what it did and what was done to mitigate that, there's some good lessons there, but it's probably not going to create the exact blueprint for what happens in our situation. So like everything we do in the classroom here at Rotor Consulting, this comes back to not one boilerplate approach, but what has become our mantra of improving one's awareness, improving one's ability to make whole body decisions, and to get a feel for this time, this situation, what can I do about it? What can I learn from history, but I might need to do some things a little bit differently. Thanks so much for all of the comments. Next month, I encourage you to join us for Dr. Stephen Laybourne, who's going to talk about improvisation in project management. Continuing with this theme that we've hit on today of improvising, when things happen, what can we do to adjust? Dr. Laybourne has done, to my knowledge, the only academic research on improvisation and also intuition in a project environment. He's a professor from Boston University. He does a wonderful job in terms of his knowledge and depth of understanding of how these particular areas can impact project management. As always, the webinar is free. Tuesday, November 1st. We have changed the schedule a little bit. You might be used to the second Tuesday of the month, but because of some things that are going on, we have moved it to November 1 at 11 o'clock Eastern. One of those things that's going on is we have in Dallas the North American Congress and Leadership Institute meeting. For those of you who are PMI leaders, you might be traveling to Dallas on Thursday, Friday, Saturday of this week. We often find 10 to 20% of the audience is an international audience. I encourage you to stop by and say hello. We will be in the Gaylord Hotel sitting by the water fountain. And here's a picture of that water fountain and what it looks like. If you're a project manager, a program manager, if you're attending Congress, if you find yourself in Dallas, please stop by. We'll be Thursday and Friday sitting in that general area in the cafe in the Gaylord by the water fountain. We'd love to say hello to you and to put a face with the name. Rotor Consulting will also be in person in Green Bay next week. We'll be talking about leadership in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We'll be in Denver and Colorado Springs in November, Denver again in December, and down in Tampa Bay, Florida, November as well. If you happen to be in one of those locations, we'd love to see you at one of the in-person events. I'll hand off now back to Christina, who will share with you how to grab your PDUs. As always, thanks so much for joining us today. All the best for project success. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Trey. And again, I thank you for your continued support of Rotor Consulting and for joining us today. I hope that you learned something new, interesting, different about this topic. I knew that a lot of you in your registration questions said that you were looking forward to this topic and this webinar, so I hope you learned something new. This concludes the end of our webinar. On your screen, you should see a link, www.rotorconsulting.com/postwebinar.php. This is where you will be able to download your PDU form, the handout for this PowerPoint presentation, as well as instructions on how to claim your PDUs. PMI has changed the way to claim PDUs, so I have tried to create instructions on how to claim our PDUs in the simplest way possible. Some of you have asked also about our LinkedIn group. You can join our LinkedIn group from the post-webinar page. At the bottom of the page, there is a LinkedIn icon that will take you to linkedin.com, and you'll be able to join our group, post a discussion or a comment. As always, I thank you again for joining us, and we will see you in 2 weeks for our next webinar on improvisation in project management. And the thing I'm looking forward to is that it is going to be another webinar on 11/1/11 at 11 a.m. So I'm going to enjoy that. Thank you again. Have a great day, and we will be chatting with you on LinkedIn. Bye.